The main point that I want to get across to you this evening is really pretty simple, and that is that ending Israel's impunity from its serial and serious violations of international law is an urgent priority, and not just for Palestinians and people who care about justice and human rights in the Middle East, but indeed for the entire global community. I use the term impunity here not in any technical legal sense, but simply to mean in its common meaning, that is, the exemption from punishment despite the commission of an offense. And for decades, indeed, since the expulsion of Palestine's majority Arab population in 1948, Israel has flouted international law without consequence, despite frequent protest, persistent protest from many elements within the international community. Israel, of course, is not the only country in the world to violate international law. But in some senses, the response of the world community, or perhaps better, the lack of response of the world community to Israel's repeated violations are unusual, if not unique. Whereas other international war criminals, such as the perpetrators of ethnic cleansing in the Balkans or of genocide in Rwanda, are duly prosecuted by specially established UN tribunals. And other illegal occupations, such as Iraq's 1990 occupation of Kuwait, are ousted by military force endorsed by the United Nations Security Council. Israel's violations of the rights of Palestinians and of the civilian populations of surrounding Arab countries, sometimes amounting to war crimes, are unpunished. Now, there is an obvious explanation for this, and that is the diplomatic cover that your southern neighbor, my country, the United States, I'm ashamed to say, has consistently provided Israel. Among other things, in the form of 42 exercises of the United States veto power in the United Nations Security Council to spare Israel the consequences of its multitude of international legal violations. The ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian Arab majority population from Palestine in 1948. Some other notable examples in the intervening years include, and this is by no means a complete list, Israel's attack on Egypt and Syria in 1967, which was justified to the world as an exercise of self-defense, but in fact was launched despite Israel's knowledge at the time that neither Arab country intended to attack Israel. Israel's annexation of Jerusalem, its now nearly 43-year-old occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and that's not a slip of the tongue. Gaza Strip continues to be occupied territory under international law. The colonization of these areas with its own civilian settlers, its 1981 attack on the Osirak nuclear power facility in Iraq, its 1982 invasion of Lebanon, and of course its 1978 invasion of Lebanon, its subsequent 18-year military occupation of that country's south, its systematic practices of torture, first made public in 1971, and which continue today, despite the Israeli Supreme Court's outlawing of some forms of torture by some, but not all, Israeli security agencies, home demolitions, detentions without trial, targeted assassinations within Israeli-controlled territory and abroad, banishments of political dissidents. The list goes on and on. All of these abuses, incidentally, are extensively documented by a host of NGOs, and in many cases by government agencies, including the U.S. State Department. It is not as though the record is unknown, in other words. These are not secrets. Then, of course, came the events about which we are gathered to remember this evening. Just over a year ago, all of us were glued to our television sets and computers, transfixed by the images of Israel's onslaught. That's, the extensive damage to civilians and to civilian property and needless deaths. focus your attention on how Israel also brutalized international law in ways that threaten to outlast the demolition of Gaza and that have consequences, potential consequences at least, far beyond that tortured land's borders. Since 2001, Israeli military lawyers have been steadily pushing to reclassify military operations in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip from the law enforcement model that is mandated by the law of occupation to one of armed conflict. Under the former, soldiers of an occupying army must, for example, arrest rather than kill opponents, and generally must use the minimum force necessary to quell disturbances. While in armed conflict, a military is still constrained by the laws of war, including the duty of distinction between combatants and civilians, and the duty to avoid attacks causing disproportionate harm to civilian persons or objects. The standard, the armed conflict standard, as contrasted to the occupation standard, permits far greater uses of force. Israel initially began pressing for this shift from the occupation law enforcement model to the armed conflict model to justify its assassinations of Palestinians in the occupied territories that clearly violated settled international law. Now, in reality, Israel had practiced targeted killings in the occupied territories in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, that is, since the 1970s, always, however, denying that it did so. But with the outbreak of the Second Intifada beginning in late 2000, Israel had stepped up the frequency of these assassinations and had resorted to spectacular means, such as airstrikes, that rendered denial futile. It was no longer possible to disclaim responsibility for these killings. Now, you may recall the 2001 so-called Mitchell Committee, the same George Mitchell, yes, who's trundling around fairly uselessly in the region these days. That was the group that was convened by President Bill Clinton to investigate the causes of the Second Intifada and to prescribe ways to end it. Israeli lawyers went before the Mitchell Committee and pleaded their case for the armed conflict model. The committee, in its report, and in a section of the report that very little attention has been paid to, criticized the blanket application of the armed conflict model to the Palestinian uprising that Israel was then facing. But it did not repudiate it altogether, and thus tacitly opened the door for its broader application. By the time of the Gaza invasion last winter, most observers, including Amnesty International, tacitly accepted Israel's framing of the conflict as an armed conflict. And their criticisms of Israel's actions in terms of the duties of distinction and the principle of proportionality displayed that they had in fact accepted the Israeli model. Now, I should point out, and as I alluded earlier, that in international legal terms, Gaza remains occupied territory. By the articles of its own disengagement plan, Israel arrogates to itself authority to patrol Gaza's airspace, coastal waters and borders, and to arrest and kill Palestinians. And it has availed itself liberally of these powers, killing 1,250 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip from the withdrawal of its settler population in September 2005 until December 27th of 2008, the beginning of the big invasion. It arrested and abducted scores, if not hundreds more.